Hey everyone, this is Jessica Kramer for MRC-TV. Today we're speaking with Jason Sneed, the Executive Director for the Honest Elections Project, about the controversial Georgia election law. Jason, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, can you tell us a little bit about the Georgia law and why this is so controversial?
Sure. So what Georgia just did a few weeks ago was pass a fairly reasonable, common sense, mainstream, and popular election law that does a few things. It actually expands the number of early voting days and early voting hours across the state. It requires voters to show a voter identification when they're casting an absentee ballot. So now you write a driver's license number on that ballot instead of doing a signature match program. It cuts off the ability of partisan or political groups to engage in electioneering and campaigning to voters while they're standing in line. And it makes a whole series of other changes to election law, all designed to improve the process for all Georgians. Now, as to the question of why this is controversial, I think that the only answer to that is politics. You've heard a lot of statements trying to malign this law as the new Jim Crow and trying to gin up some outrage against it. But I think the reason that you see rhetoric like that is because if you try to tell Georgians that they're not supposed to like additional early in-person voting opportunities and they're not supposed to like better secured absentee ballots, they're going to probably ask why, because those are fairly popular.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I thought was interesting was when you spoke with the Daily Signal, you had mentioned that this is increasing available early voting and absentee voting more so than Democrat-controlled states. Can you explain how and what's going on in these blue states?
Yeah, so there are a number of states, for instance, New York or the president's home state of Delaware, that actually offer fewer days of early voting than Georgia does, which ironically enough makes Georgia more progressive than these progressive bastions. And that, I think, raises the question of where's the outrage in Delaware at the lack of early voting? Where's the outrage in New York at the lack of no excuse absentee voting, which is also something that Georgia offers, but which Senator Schumer's home state does not. So there are, ironically enough, a lot of these blue bastions that have, to use their own rhetoric, more suppressive or restrictive voting laws than Georgia, and yet Georgia is being held out as the poster child of the new Jim Crow. And I think that there's no finer way to show exactly how misleading and deceitful and nakedly partisan the left is being right now than Stacey Abrams saying that Jim Crow 2.0 or Jim Crow in a suit and tie has taken hold in Georgia, even though Georgia offers 17 to 19 days of early voting, but then going up and praising New Jersey, where liberals in that state just for the first time authorized early voting and only offered 9 days. And she said that was fantastic for democracy. So she's speaking out of both sides of her mouth, as is most of the left on this issue.
Well, speaking of Jim Crow, exactly where are they getting that comparison? Because I think for a lot of us, we're not seeing it. So can you explain at least their reasoning on why they're calling these Jim Crow laws?
Well, I think that the reasons, again, come back to politics. We have to remember that right now there is a piece of legislation in Congress called H.R. 1, and this bill would fundamentally rewrite the election laws of all 50 states. It would require, for instance, that states authorize people to vote whether they have an ID or not. So any state with a voter identification law, that law is effectively nullified. It would require no excuse absentee voting, but it would eliminate basic ballot safeguards. It would require organized and political ballot trafficking be allowed in all 50 states. And these are all unpopular measures which really only appeal to folks on the fringe. And the reason I mention this is because one of the ways that the left has chosen to try to push this forward, particularly in the Senate, is to amp up the outrage and amp up the pressure. And calling quote-unquote restrictive voting laws like what Georgia has just done, where they're trying to bring greater confidence, greater transparency, and greater security to the voting process, Jim Crow, is one way where they can gin up and manufacture outrage and then use that as a means of advancing H.R. 1. It's really about constructing a narrative and turning Georgia's law into a straw man for the rest of the country that they can easily attack.
Yeah, well, for folks that aren't familiar with the Georgia law or what's going on with these bills in Congress, you had said that there are some myths that the media is promoting. Exactly what are they about this law?
Well, for one thing, that this is a restrictive voting law. You know, if you are expanding the number of days for early voting, such that Georgia actually offers more than some of the blue states, as we talked about, is expanding the number of hours at polling places. So you've got more days and more hours of early voting. I think it's very hard to say that Georgia's law is restrictive. Georgia also kept and is improving its no excuse absentee system. I know a lot of people have issues with that, but it's hard to say if someone says if you are a registered voter, you can request an absentee ballot, no questions asked, that is a restrictive policy. And even though they attack the requirement for voter ID laws with absentee ballots as restrictive, we have to keep in mind that every state has an obligation to verify the identity of a voter, including an absentee voter. And what Georgia used to do was use signature matching. Well, one of the problems with signature matching is that it's subjective and can be prone to error.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we have seen statistically nationwide is that minority voters are actually more likely to have their ballots rejected because of signature mismatch. So ironically enough, and you don't hear this in the media very often, moving to an objective voter ID standard actually will help all voters, including minority voters, make sure that their ballots, when they're validly cast, are properly counted. And we also, of course, provide free IDs as well. So these are just some of the myths that you hear. But as you can see, when you actually drill down to the facts and look at the nuance, it's actually very much the opposite. This is a law that most people find to be reasonable, most people find to be common sense. And actually, recent polling in Georgia shows exactly that. Voters actually, on the merits, support the law.
Yeah, the voter ID thing kills me. I mean, we're going to have to get new IDs even to fly. You need an ID for everything. And to suggest that
right.
a minority of people aren't able to receive an ID, I think is preposterous. But thank you so much for your expertise on this issue. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.